Hello, I'm Rich Sander. I'm here today with Massimo Pigliucci, a good friend of mine I've known for you for
I don't know, a decade, maybe?
at least a decade, probably a little bit more. So in terms of your major work for the last few years and stuff, it's been around this idea about Stoicism, that it developed back in Roman times, and that there are some universal values there that are applicable to us even today and stuff. What are those main principles that you see out of Stoicism that are applicable to us today?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the reason I started getting into it is because I consider, as you know, I consider myself, and I still consider myself, a psychohumanist. But when it came to actual crisis in my life, like, a divorce or my father dying or changing career, all of which happened at the same time, actually, as it turns out, the same year. I found that, to my surprise, I have to say, I found that psychohumanism wasn't very helpful. Because psychohumanism turns out to be essentially a nice list of things that I agree with. People should have the right to marry who they want. There should be no discrimination against, by gender, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. Basically, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is essentially very, very similar to the various versions of the Humanist Manifestos. The problem is that those are broad principles with which I agree, but when it comes to actual day-to-day life, it's like, all right, fine, I respect other people's, rights to do this or that or the other, but what am I supposed to do when something happens to me in my life, to my loved ones, and so on and so forth. So I was kind of surprised because, I grew up Catholic. I left Catholicism when I was a teenager. Mm-hmm. And ever since, I consider myself a psychohumanism. Started reading Bertrand Russell first, and then Paul Kurtz, and became friends with Paul. Wrote for psychohumanist magazines. But then I said, wow, this is interesting. So if I were still a Catholic, I would probably go to my priest, and I would go to church, and I would sort of open the Gospels and seek consolation or help that way. And what am I going to do? Open Paul Kurtz at random and read some sentences? That's not going to work.
So is that analogous to you to open up and reading a psalm versus looking at psychohumanist values?
Well, that's the question, manifesto? Right? That's the question. So I thought naively, as it turns out, that perhaps not analogous, but that psychohumanism would provide some kind of similar structure. When it came to the actual crisis, it turned out it didn't. And maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. But what then happened was like, okay, so I still think of myself, of course, as a secular person. I'm certainly not going to go back to religion.
You see yourself as like an atheist,
yes, right? I see myself as an atheist, a secular,
pro-science skeptic,
all of that sort of
secularist,
stuff.
Obviously.
Yes, obviously. So it's like, okay, but what else? What's going to be helpful
here?
Yeah, what is going to provide me with a general framework for navigating essentially the rest of my life, not just the current crisis, the then current crisis, but the rest of my life. You just mentioned a number of things, for instance, all of which are, and I don't mean that this in a disparaging fashion, but all of which are kind of negative positions, like being an atheist.
Yeah.
Well, being an atheist literally means, in my version of the notion, that I am a theist. I am without any positive belief in God. Yeah. Same way in which I am a unicornist. I don't have any belief in unicorns, right? But that doesn't imply any particular positive belief.
Yeah.
Right? So you could be an atheist.
What's next?
An atheist and belong to any political party or endorse any kind of metaphysical position. Mm-hmm. You can still be an atheist. Being a skeptic is something very similar. So a skeptic means, a scientific skeptic means somebody who is critical of certain notions that are not evidence-based, that seem to go against current science, such as, paranormal phenomena, UFOs, and all that sort of stuff. Great, but that's
nonsense on stilts, right?
Right. So I wrote an entire book on this thing, right? Nonsense on stilts.
Literally called Nonsense on Stilts.
But that too is a negative position. It's like, okay, well, so I don't accept this and don't accept that. Why not? Well, because they go against sort of currently accepted science. They don't make any sense from a sort of rational perspective or evidence-based perspective. Great, but none of those things, being an atheist, being a skeptic, and so on and so forth, really amounts to some kind of positive framework for navigating your life. Now, I just put out a book that is co-edited with two friends and colleagues of mine, Sky Cleary and Dan Kaufman. It's called How to Live a Good Life. And the book is actually a collection of 15 essays by different authors. Each essay is written by somebody who not only lives a particular philosophy, studies and knows about a particular philosophy or religion, but actually lives according to that philosophy or religion. So we have chapters on Buddhism, on Confucianism, on Stoicism, of course, on existentialism, on Christianity, on Judaism, and so on and so forth. And in fact, ethical culture. Right, exactly. And Kaizen wrote the one on ethical culture. And that was really the kind of project that I was looking for when I started having my own little crisis a few years ago. That is, I was looking for something that would provide structure. Now, where do you look for something to provide structure? I did try Buddhism. I started reading Buddhist texts because, hey, everybody told me, why don't you try Buddhism? Meditation is helpful. They seem happy. They seem fine. And meditation is helpful for a number of things. It's like, okay, sure, let's try. The problem is meditation is helpful, but meditation itself, of course, is just a technique within the broader philosophy of Buddhism. And the philosophy itself just didn't speak to me. It was like the language was alien, obviously, because I didn't, at least in part, because I didn't grow up in that sort of culture. Mm-hmm. I just couldn't get around accepting the metaphysics. Buddhists believe in karma, reincarnation, and all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. It's like, no, that's not gonna work for me.
Yeah.
So very quickly, I had zeroed in an area of Western philosophy, which is often referred to as virtue ethics. So virtue ethics is an approach that was developed by the ancient Greeks and Romans, although people have actually argued that Confucianism is a type of virtue ethics, even though it developed entirely independently. Mm-hmm. And the basic sort of starting point of virtue ethics is that the most important thing that you can do in your life is to try to work on your character, to become a better person by actively working on your character. Now, there are different schools of virtue ethics, and each one of these kind of cashes out this general idea in different fashions. The notion is that we should try to live what the Greeks called the eudaimonic life. Eudaimonia today gets translated often as happiness, but happiness is kind of such a vague concept that it's not clear what the heck it means anyway. My favorite translation of eudaimonia is simply the life worth living. The kind of life that you get to the end of it, look back and you said, yeah, that was not wasted. Right?
Yes.
It's like, could have been better perhaps, but it wasn't wasted. It was like,
Well, I think we're all going to say that.
Yeah, we're all going to say it could have been better, right? But at least it wasn't wasted. It's not the kind of thing you regret, right?
Exactly.
I said, great, fine. So where do I start? And in virtue ethics, typically you start with Aristotle. So I read the Nicomachean Ethics, which is the major book by Aristotle where he writes about this kind of stuff. And it's great. It tells you that in order to live a eudaimonic life, you need to cultivate your virtue, and he actually lists a bunch of 12 different kinds of virtues. Aristotle was very much into lists.
It's almost like a Socratic way of looking at it. And it's like I'm examining all this, and I'm saying, correct, how do I figure this out?
Correct. In fact, all of the so-called eudaimonic schools come out of Socrates. They're all elaborations in one way or another of Socrates. But Aristotle's particular elaboration, which is the most popular, is like, so yeah, you need to work on your virtues and your character, but also you need to have, to be sufficiently smart, to have a little bit of money, to have good looks, because otherwise your life is going to be screwed. And I said, good looks, well, that takes me out of the run, so that's not going to work. Fine. So it's what I'm saying is it's a little elitist. Yeah. It's the kind of thing that unless you have a certain amount of luck, which Aristotle rightly said, it's like, if you're completely unlucky, you're screwed. There's nothing you can do about it. I said, no, that can't be right. That doesn't sound right. So the next stop was Epicurus. Epicureanism, as you probably know, is very popular among psycho-humanists for a number of reasons. First of all, because Epicurus, although he was not an atheist, he was definitely set against priests and temples and things like that. He told people that they shouldn't fear death because there's nothing in the afterlife. God, if he exists, doesn't give a crap about us. And it's all about the priests taking advantage of your fears. Mm-hmm. So great. So that goes well with the ethical, with the psycho-humanist ethics and ethos. Great. Not only that, but Epicurus was an atomist. So he believed that the world is made of particles that sort of bump into each other, and that's how things come together. Great. So that kind of goes well with modern science. Not in the sense that he was a modern physicist, but in the sense that it's like, it was a materialist.
Time.
Yeah, for his time, right? He got it right. It was like definitely no mysticism, definitely sort of material stuff and all that. Great. So let's look at Epicurus. And the whole thing was, Epicureans put an emphasis on friendship, on developing close relationships with people. That's what for them that makes a good life, a eudaimonic life. However, the most important thing for an Epicurean is try to go through life without experiencing pain, especially emotional pain. In fact, Epicurus defines pain, absence of pain, as the highest pleasure that a human being can possibly experience.
So it's just like avoiding pain.
Avoiding pain at all costs. Well, he explicitly says that one thing you definitely want to do in order to avoid pain is get out of any kind of social and political involvement, because those are painful. Now he's right, as you know, right? I mean, like just look at modern politics, and yes,
I could see myself 700 pounds too, because I eat all the time because
yeah,
I feel hungry.
Right? So the problem is, yeah, fine, he's right, but on the other hand, I don't see myself or a meaningful life for me without social and political involvement.
Yeah. And
so
pain,
that's how
and pain, pain has helped me try to define where my boundaries are,
right,
where I can see that, hey, I need to make a change. I see a better path away from it, but I needed to experience in order to realize that I needed to make a change.
Correct. So pain is part of the human experience. You don't, sure, you don't go for it. You don't seek it. In a positive fashion, but no, that didn't work. So,
but we're not embracing it.
You're not embracing it.
We're saying it exists. We're going to deal with it.
And you have to deal with it.
And we're going to go on.
So that was out as well. So Epicurean was. So now I was kind of running out of options, right? Because okay, and at that point, I opened up my Twitter feed of all things one morning, and I saw this thing that said, "Help us celebrate Stoic Week." And I said, what the hell is Stoic Week? And why would anybody want to celebrate the Stoics? I mean, it's not, like, what is that? But I saw
what was your first impression of Stoics?
Well, so that tweet, which I saw was coming out of the University of Exeter in England, so this was like a reputable place, brought immediately to mind, memories. It's like, oh, that Stoics, wait a minute. Right, so I did read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations when I was in college, and I was like, oh yeah, that was an interesting book. I never thought about him as a Stoic in the sense of sort of articulating a philosophy of life, but sure, I remember that. And then I thought about it some more, and I said, oh wait, Seneca was also a Stoic, and I translated Seneca from Latin when I was in high school, and it was kind of cool. Mm-hmm. Although I never put the two together, interestingly.
But for most people, Stoicism is kind of like a stiff upper lip,
right,
and it's
suppressing
moderate,
emotion, right?
Yeah, right. That's the common.
Exactly, and that was my first reaction. It's like, come on, what? But I was curious because
being Stoic.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, oh. But I was curious for a number of reasons. First of all, because I remember both Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, and I thought, okay, well, those are actually thoughtful guys. Yeah. That maybe there is something to learn here. And also, I realized that Stoicism also is a type of eudaimonic philosophy. It was also derived from a branch of sort of Socratic teachings. So I said, all right, let's sign up for these Stoic weeks, see what's all about. I mean, why not? And that changed my life. Because what happened was, Stoic Week is still done every year, usually in October or early November. And what it is you sign up, you download some material, you start reading, the basics about Stoicism. There's a reading list, mm-hmm, and then there's a series of exercises. That was the first interesting surprise. So this is not just theoretical stuff. You're actually supposed to do guided meditations. You're supposed to keep a journal about how your things are going in your life. You're supposed to actually be proactive about practicing the philosophy, not just reading stuff. It's like, that's interesting. So I did that for a week, and by the end of the week, I thought, wow, this is like it's blowing my mind. This particularly one of the Stoics, a guy named Epictetus. Now, I have a PhD in philosophy. I never heard of Epictetus before. So it's like, what the hell? What's going on here? Turns out
you can still learn something new.
Exactly. You can always learn something new. So turns out Epictetus was actually a very prominent late first century, early second century Roman Stoic philosopher who remained prominent and well known all the way into the 19th century, I discovered later.
Really?
For instance, there are 2 books that are attributed to Epictetus, although he actually didn't write the books. These are one of his students' notes, essentially, from when he was lecturing. But the 2 books are called Discourses and the Enchiridion, which means the manual or the handbook. And the handbook, in particular, had been used by Christian monks throughout the Middle Ages as a source for spiritual exercises. It had George Washington brought it with him in battle and read it to his troops. Thomas Jefferson had a copy that he gave, and Benjamin Franklin had a copy that in their libraries. So it's like, wow, wait a minute, this guy was really interesting, really, really influential. For some reason, at the beginning of the 20th century, he started sort of going into an eclipse.
Didn't have an advocate.
He did not have an advocate. That's right. But now it did because there had been this resurgence of interest in Stoicism over the last 10 or 20 years or so.
Do you think that's aligned with this increase, especially in Europe, of humanism, and people are saying, okay, what else is there?
Yeah. I think it partly is a result of the increasing number of so-called knowns, right? The people that don't actually accept any kind of mainstream religion.
Yeah, the nuns. Yeah.
The nuns.
Without the habits.
Yes, exactly. Which doesn't mean that they're all atheists. Some set of them certainly are.
Yeah.
But other people may be so-called spiritual but not religious kind of people. That's, I think, one reason for the resurgence of Stoicism. Another reason is that we live in a situation, in a sort of society, from a point of view of society at large, that is actually not very different from the kind of society that existed when all of these philosophies, not just Stoicism, but also Epicureanism and Aristotelianism and so on and so forth, actually came out. So if you think about it, these are all referred to as Hellenistic philosophies. The Hellenistic period went from the death of Alexander the Great and the collapse of the Macedonian Empire to the beginning of the Roman Empire. Though that period in the Mediterranean area was of great turmoil. Major changes were happening. Things were out of control. People had no idea what was going to happen from today to tomorrow.
Because there wasn't a big power kind of controlling everything.
That's right. Everything was falling in pieces and changing every day.
There's all these little nation states going on, doing their own thing.
Lots of violence, lots of, a sense of, I don't know what to do, and I don't know what the heck is happening here, and nothing is under my control. So all of those philosophies emerged in response, to some extent, to that kind of sort of chaotic situation. Now, move to the 21st century, late 20th century, early 21st century. Yeah. Well, we're still facing the possibility of nuclear Armageddon. Climate change collapse is almost a certainty at this point. Politically speaking, forget it. It's a mess. So yeah, we kind of live in similar kind of situation. I mean, we also went, of course, not that long ago, through 2 world wars. So it's like this is really chaos. It's really a situation where people increasingly feel in the same way in which the Hellenistic people
well, maybe
felt.
Steven Pinker might think a little differently about it.
Yeah, he's a damn optimist. But no, Pinker has an interest.
I am a little bit of an optimist too, but I tell you, the way things have been the last 4 or 5 years, it's like I got to be a little more skeptical about things. Yeah.
Well, Pinker has definitely a fundamental point on his side, which is things, broadly speaking, have gotten better. I mean, if you honestly ask yourself, right, is there any other place or time on earth that you would rather be alive? I think the answer is pretty much no. You want to be alive in the 21st century in either a Western country or one of a few of Asian countries like Japan, and that's it.
Or maybe in a few years ahead.
Right. Yeah. Even maybe a few years ahead.
We can work some of this out, and then it'll be even better.
Perhaps. But so he's right on that. Yeah. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
The problem with sort of the optimistic look on things is that it risks making you underestimating the very real risks and potential catastrophes that are just around the corner.
And make you slow to adapt and change to the circumstances that if you're not taking an active control in,
Right.
you're going to be subject to whatever that is.
Exactly. It might, that kind of attitude might make us complacent about, oh, well, things are going better and better, so what am I worried about? Well,
Yeah.
there's a lot to worry about, even though things in fact have been
Yeah.
going, better and better. But let me go back briefly to Stoicism. So
Yeah.
I gave you kind of the personal story and a
Yep.
little bit of the historical context, but what the hell is it? So how does that actually work, right?
And how does it make you feel better?
And how
That's-
makes you
that's
feel
what-
better, right? So Stoicism is, the goal of Stoicism is not to make you feel better. It's not to make you happy, whatever that means. Is to allow you to live the kind of life that I was mentioning earlier, the kind of life that you get to the end of it is like, yeah, that was actually worth living. In practice, what does that mean? You work constantly on improving yourself. How do you improve yourself? There's a couple of ways in which the Stoics look at this issue. One of them, the most popular probably, is by using what they call the four cardinal virtues. So everything you do in life, day to day, not only just long-term plans, but even day to day, you should constantly ask yourself 4 questions. Is this thing that I'm about to do practically wise? And I'll tell you what that means in a minute. It's a
Talk about being vague.
right. It's well, with practical wisdom. It's a funny word. The original word, the Greek word, is phronesis, and we should probably just use the Greek word. But is it phronetic? Let's put it
Yes.
that way. Is it courageous? Is it just? And is it temperate? These are the so-called 4 cardinal virtues. They may be familiar to people who grew up in a Christian environment because Thomas Aquinas took those 4 and just brought them wholesale into Christianity, adding the 3 more obviously Christian ones of faith, hope, and charity. Right? So there are 7 cardinal virtues in Christianity. But
Yeah.
the first 4 are the Stoic ones.
So we have that in common.
We have that in common, for sure. Right. The Stoics don't believe much in faith, hope, and that sort of stuff. But certainly the 4 cardinal virtues. Now, in practice, what does that mean? Well, let's say, for instance, that I'm facing a very specific situation. I go to work and I see my boss, harassing a coworker. The question is, should I intervene? Should I do something about it? Should I say something?
Is it right to do something?
Is it right to do something? Well, here's the test, right? So, is it practically wise? Practical wisdom for the Stoics has a very specific meaning. It basically, things are practically wise if they're good for your character, and they're not practically wise if they're bad for your character. So, is it good for my character to intervene in a situation where somebody's being arrested? Yes, because that's one way you improve your character. You become a better person by being actively concerned with other people.
And ignoring it is
Not ignoring it,
bad
right, exactly.
for your
Ignoring it is
character
bad.
because you're ignoring it.
Yes, it undermines your own integrity, right? So it's
Yes.
like, oh, I'm looking the other way while this guy's being, or this person is being mistreated. So the answer in the case of the first virtue is yes. Second, is it courageous? Well, yeah, it does take courage because I risk consequences, right? If I talk to my boss, I could be reprimanded, I could get on his bedside, I could be fired, depending on what the situation is. So yeah, that requires courage, clearly. Is it just? Well, obviously it is. In what sense? For the Stoics, justice is simply fairness to other people, treating other people as you would like to be treated. Now, would you like, if your boss was harassing you, would you like somebody to intervene on your behalf? I would assume yes. Well, since we are both human beings endowed with the same capacities and the same kind of, we should be treated in the same way, therefore, yes, I should, in fact, intervene. It's the just thing to do. What about temperance?
But sometimes people, when they think about certain things for themselves and saying, oh, I want to be treated this way, sometimes that's not even the right thing. They have maybe sometimes low expectations about how they get treated or want to be treated. And
That's
stuff.
right. That's right.
So maybe it's more about how do I elicit that better response?
Yes, you should try to see yourself as so. I want to get to the temperance part as well, but to address your issue, yes, that's right. So one of the things that I find attractive about Stoicism is that it's not just about helping other people. It's also about helping yourself. You should treat yourself as a person who has dignity and is worthy of respect, integrity, and so on and so forth. Therefore, yes, you should want other people to intervene on your behalf if you're in distress. The fourth one is interesting, temperance. So temperance means to do things in the right measure, right? And in this case, that might mean something like the following. So if I see the situation with my boss and I just mutter under my breath, it's like, you shouldn't do that. And my boss doesn't even hear me, that's clearly underreacting. Yeah, technically I said something, but really, no.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you don't want to also go up to the, go to the opposite extreme, go up to your boss and punch him on the nose. Because that seems like an overreaction to the situation.
Or yell at the top of your lungs.
Yeah, right. So temperance means, yes, you are going to act, but you're going to act properly. You're going to act, you have to look at the situation and say, okay, what is the best course of action given this particular situation? And if the situation is different, there is a different course of action.
And context to that situation matters greatly.
Correct. In fact, it's all about context. It's almost all about context. You have to be able to assess the context and say, okay, this is the right action here in this moment. This is not the right action here in this moment. One of the things that I like about Stoicism is that there's no such thing as right or wrong in an absolute sense. An action is virtuous or non-virtuous depending not only on the consequences of that action, but also on the motivations of the agent who actually performs the action. Let's say, for instance, we are here at ethical culture, right? So one of the things that ethical culture does is, helps feed poor people and things like that. Great. So suppose that I volunteer for ethical culture for the soup kitchen. A lot of modern ethicists, a lot of modern moral philosophers would say that's a right action, that's a good thing to do, period. A Stoic would say, well, why are you doing it? Because if it turns out that you're doing it not because you actually want to help people, but because you need a line in your resume so that you can apply for a job, showing that you are concerned, that you volunteer for a local organization, then that's not a good thing.
Or just making ourselves feel better like we're doing something.
Right. It's not a virtuous action at that point, right? Because you're doing it for yourself, you're not doing it for other people.
But there is some good in that action compared to some other things.
That's right. The consequences are positive. That's why they make a distinction between good and virtuous. The consequences are positive. Sure, you're still helping other people.
Yeah.
But it's not helping your character, it's not virtuous, because you're actually doing it for other reasons.
Uh-huh.
Right. So I find that this way of orienting, this kind of framework, it's very helpful in practice, because everything you do, we're not talking only major things, we're also talking about relatively minor interactions with my friends, with my co-workers, with my wife, with my daughter, and so on and so forth.
Direct interactions.
Yeah, everything that I do, it turns out I can use the four cardinal, after all, the core cardinal virtues for a reason, right? They're like the cardinal points on a compass, right?
Yeah.
So they orient you and say, am I doing something that is virtuous or not? That's one big idea about Stoicism. The second big idea, we could talk forever, and we're not going to, but the second big idea is something called the dichotomy of control, and this comes out of early Stoicism, but it's particularly well articulated by Epictetus, the guy that I mentioned earlier. So the dichotomy of control, you might be familiar with the Serenity Prayer, right? So, which I actually never remember exactly how it goes, but it's this thing that was actually written by an American theologian in the early part of the 20th century, and it's used by 12-step organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous, right? And it essentially asks you to have the wisdom to tell the difference between what you can change and what you cannot change, and then have the courage to change what you can and the serenity to accept what you cannot, right? Great. That notion, turns out, is actually found in a number of different cultures. It's found in medieval Judaism, it's found in 8th century Buddhism, you find it in Taoism, you find it in a bunch of different things. The most ancient version that I was able to find is in Epictetus, right at the beginning of the Enchiridion, of his handbook, section 1.1. It says, some things are up to us and other things are not up to us. And then it makes a list of the things that are up to you and what are not up to you. And
well,
then
there's a common saying in culture about that. It's like, well, I can do what I can do, but there's some things I cannot do or have control over.
Correct. And what Stoicism teaches you, and it's an easy lesson to understand. It's incredibly difficult to actually put into practice, right? But what Stoicism tells you is like, great, so you should concentrate only on the things that are up to you, only on the things you can control. And the rest, you should develop an attitude of equanimity or serenity or acceptance. It's like, sometimes things go your way, sometimes they don't. That's a matter of happenstance. That depends on what other people do. That depends on the circumstances. You should be okay either way. You should train yourself to be okay either way. Why? Well, because you do have a locus of control. There are some things that actually are up to you. Again, how does that translate into practice? Let me give you a very basic example. Suppose that I go up for an interview, a job interview. Right? What is up to me? Well, to put together the best resume that I can put together without lying, an actual honest resume, because lying would be unvirtuous, right?
Yes.
To prepare for the interview to the best of my abilities, to try to be as relaxed and as ready to go on the morning of the interview.
Appropriate appearance.
Right. Yeah. Prepare your appearance and so on and so forth. All of that stuff is up to me, right? What is not up to me, of course, is the outcome of the interview, because there could be competition for the job, which is better than me, and so I'm not going to job. It could be that the person who's doing the interview got off the bed in the wrong way that morning, and he's pissed off at the universe, and therefore he's going to also take it on you. There could be all sorts of reasons why the interview isn't going to go well.
And it might not be the right job for you.
And it may not be the right job for you, right? So the idea is, by focusing on the things that are under your control and developing this attitude of whatever happens, you essentially are shifting your goals from outcomes to intentions. Because the outcomes are not up to you, the intentions are up to you. Now, of course, there happens to be a correlation between intentions and outcomes, right? The more you prepare for something, the more likely it is that actually it's going to happen. But of course, it's not guaranteed.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the fundamental things that Stoicism teaches you, that you should always focus on your intentions and your preparation, not on your outcomes. The outcomes sometimes go your way, sometimes they don't go your way.
Yeah, I had that kind of aha moment in my early 20s where I said, I had super high expectations of everything, and they're not happening. Right. And it's like, well, I don't really have any direct control over all that stuff. And,
exactly.
And a lot of times an interaction with somebody on a day-to-day basis, they're pissed off, they have family problems, they're just in a sour mood. So to deal with that particular person, to elicit the best out of them, I think is what you're talking about. This is like, because you have control over that.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So in terms of practicing all these different aspects of Stoicism and getting to that right intention and stuff, how does somebody do that on a day-to-day basis? How do they integrate that into their lives?
So there's a number of exercises. The Enchiridion itself, as I said, was used by Christian monks throughout the Middle Ages as a book of spiritual exercises, because it's made of short little paragraphs where Epictetus tells you, okay, here's what you do, here's how you practice, here's what you should be mindful of. My friend Greg Lopez and I wrote a book actually about this that came out earlier this year. It's called The Handbook for New Stoics. And it's 52 exercises, all culled from the ancient literature, but updated with on the basis of, I'm a scientist, so on the basis of evidence coming from cognitive behavioral therapy, which is, by the way, was in fact originally influenced by Stoicism. It was cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a very popular evidence-based type of psychotherapy. Was begun in the late 50s, early 60s, and the two major people that got it started, Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis, were both directly influenced by the Stoics. They looked at the Stoic literature and said, look at that. These guys actually have an interesting intuitive psychology that we can systematize and apply on a more standard basis.
It comes down to the scientific method. It's looking at the world, seeing the way it is. How can I test that? How can other people check me to see if it works?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
That comes to the practice of Stoicism to say, okay, these are how you look at certain things. This is how you go about it, and it comes to your outcome. Right.
So in terms of exercise, as I said, I mentioned 52. Let me give you a couple of examples of how.
Is that like one a week?
Yeah, the notion is that you can actually try one a week for an entire year if you want to, although in the book, Greg and I provide a shortcut of 9 crucial exercises. You can start with those and see what happens. But the kind of exercises that, for instance, I do on a regular basis include the following. One of the standard exercises is called the Philosophical Diary, and essentially it's inspired by Marco Aurelius' meditation. The Meditations was actually his personal diary. It was not meant for publication, in fact, originally. But it's not the kind of diary where you write down, oh, today I had coffee with so and so, and that sort of stuff. It's a philosophical diary, so it's supposed to be focusing on what you did right or wrong or could have done better. And so, in fact, one way to do this is every night you sit down for a few minutes and you write down the answers to the following questions. What did I do right today? Because, if you did something right, great. You need to make a mental note of it because you want to move more and more toward that. What did I do wrong? When did I go wrong? What is it that I actually did not react well to a particular situation? Why? Not because you want to, flagellate yourself or beat yourself up or anything like that, because you want to learn.
Yes.
Right? You want to move away from that kind of behavioral pattern. And then the third question is, what could I do better under similar circumstances? Because believe it or not, our life is not actually as varied and as most people seem to think. We run into the same situations, the same people over and over. And so, maybe I didn't react correctly today to this particular situation, but you know what? I bet something like this is going to happen in the near future. So now that I'm mindful about it, I can come up with strategies.
And that's something, a very similar technique, or almost exactly the same kind of technique that I used in reviews with employees. It's like, okay, we're going to have a conversation about your performance, what you did. So tell me one thing that I did to you as an employee that you like, so I can keep doing it. Yeah. And then one thing that you was not helpful. And another thing is, what would you like me to see me do in the future to help you be a better employee?
Exactly.
And stuff. And that's the same process. And I think it's about listening to other people, taking that feedback, and making action on it.
That's right. That's exactly right. A second exercise that I find particularly useful and sort of meaningful is, it can be done in a number of ways, but it's usually referred to as an exercise in mild self-deprivation. So here's how it works. Usually it's about physical stuff. So in my case, let's say once a week or twice a week I fast for either an entire day or 20 hours or something like that.
Intermittent fasting, or?
Yeah, but it's not for a diet thing. It's like, although yes, people do it also for that reason. Or let's say instead of fasting, another thing you can do is you abstain from drinking alcohol for a day or 2 days or whatever it is every week.
So for Italian, that's
pretty hard. That's serious.
That's really serious work.
I mean, having dinner without a glass of wine is it's almost inconceivable for an Italian. A third one is what I call the walk through the mall. So you deliberately go into a place where there's a lot of shops, and then very slowly you walk from one shop to another, you take a look at the merchandise, and then you go through the other side and repeat to yourself something on the lines of, boy, I didn't know there was so much stuff I didn't need. Now, why would you want to do this sort of thing?
Deprive me of all that stuff.
Right. The reason for doing these kind of exercises is, there's at least a couple of reasons. One is that you remind yourself actually of the things that you readily do have available and take for granted. This is what modern psychologists call the hedonic treadmill. We get so used to this, to have stuff, to have dinner ready, to have the wine available, and so on and so forth, that we kind of take it for granted. So from time to time, forcing yourself to sort of do without them for a day or two, or whatever it is, it kind of becomes an exercise in being grateful. Like, look at that.
I appreciate that.
I appreciate that, right? Then you fast for 24 hours or 36 hours, and then the following meal, no matter what it is, it's going to be great. It's going to really feel very good, right? That sort of stuff. The other thing is you remind yourself that you actually don't need a lot of these things, certainly not in the quantity in which modern consumerist society keeps telling you that you do need them, right? So especially when it comes to sort of consumer items.
Yeah, like the minimalist movement is like, we got way too much stuff, everybody's getting stuff, your stuff is controlling your life because you got so much of it. You got to get away from it.
Exactly. Stoicism in general is not good for consumerism. It's not really a friend of consumerism, because Stoics tend to be a little bit on the minimalist side from that perspective. So those are two kinds of exercises. A third one that I really like and then I do irregularly, I do only once when I have the opportunity, is called the sunrise meditation. This comes from actually from Marcus Aurelius, who talks about it in detail, but it actually took it from the Pythagoreans, so even before Stoicism, because the Pythagoreans were like 3 or 4 centuries earlier. And basically what it is you get up in the morning before sunrise, you find a spot where you are going to be able to see the sunrise, and you just stay there and wait until the whole thing happens. Never look at the sun directly. Don't do that. Now, why would you want to do that? It's uncomfortable, right? You know, you get up early. Often it's cold. It's not exactly a comfortable thing. But the reason you do it is because you want to remind yourself that you're actually part of a broader universe where things have been going on for literally millions of years, sometimes billions of years, regardless of your existence, regardless of your individual problems, your individual, things that seem so important to you. Like you get up in the morning, it's like
putting yourself in context.
Right. You put yourself in context, and you remind yourself that there is a connection with the broader universe. Something that we dwellers of the 21st century, especially if we live in cities, we rarely do. Because, in New York, when was the last time you saw a star? It's not an easy thing to do. So it's a nice kind of relaxing meditation where you sort of slow down for a minute and you take your half an hour to 45 minutes to just appreciate that you're part of a broader universe. Psychologically, that also helps you, as you were saying, putting your own problems into a little bit more of perspective. Marcus Aurelius often reminds himself in the meditations, like, all right, fine. Today you met this guy that was trying to take advantage of you. There's this other guy that was trying to backstab you, etc., etc. Fine. But remember, your existence is a very tiny little brief moment in time. It's surrounded by an eternity before and after, during which you don't exist. So, really,
the sun's going to come up tomorrow.
The sun's going to come up no matter what,
not.
right? Whether the empire falls or not, or whether you're having your problems with your boss or not, the sun is going to come up tomorrow. Now, that's not going to solve your problem, but it is going to put in a little bit more of a perspective and say, okay, let's calm down. And
back
of course,
to the
calming down,
yeah.
yes, in a context. And calming down, it's often a way to sort of then solve, address the problem more effectively. If you just freak out all the time, that's not going to be very useful.
Yeah, you get so caught up in, I got to do this, I got to do this, I got to do this, and it's like, I got to slow down.
Yes.
I got to stop and listen and let the world come about me.
Yeah.
In terms of the Stoic points of view, where do you think they intersect with what secular humanism is, and
Right.
where is that additional benefit of Stoicism?
Yeah.
How would you maybe briefly describe that?
Those are great questions. The first one, how do they intersect? Well, an obvious place of intersection is that the Stoics were also the first ancient philosophers in the Western tradition, at least, to consider themselves cosmopolitan. In fact, they use the word cosmopolitan, which means literally citizen of the world. Mm-hmm. Which means that they were adamant about the fact that men, women, slaves, regular people, whatever your emperors and so on, they're all the same. We're all the same.
We're people.
We're people. And we have the same integrity, the same dignity, the same, we deserve the same respect, and so on and so forth. They were among the first, for instance, to say that women have the same intellectual abilities as men. This is, 2,000 years ago, or 2,300 years ago. That's pretty ahead of their time, right? They were also not exactly pacifists, but they were definitely against the use of violence. Violence always has to be the very last resort. First, you try to talk to people. First, you try to, teach people or converse with people. As Marcus Aurelius says, the next thing is you endure people. You say, all right, fine, I can't convince you. Okay, but this is your opinion, this is my opinion, fine. We can be okay. Violence is always the last resort and always under extreme circumstances. So as it turns out, a lot of the values that Stoics endorse are actually very similar to the values that I understand secular humanists endorse. So in that sense, and of course Stoicism is also science friendly. They were materialists. They believed that the universe is made of matter. It's true that they used the word God, but they identified God with nature. So yeah, I can live with that. Mm-hmm. I don't have to use the word God, but I can use nature instead directly, but that's what they meant. They did use the word soul, but they clearly meant something made of matter that dies with the body. So we would call that today, your mind or something like that. So,
or your heart.
Or your heart. In fact, they actually thought that it was located in the heart until Galen, who was Marcus Aurelius' physician, actually made a very good argument based on an anatomical dissection that now it's the brain, it's not the heart. So they were materialists. They believed in universal cause and effect. So they were, they really, their entire philosophy is very science friendly. It's
a scientific method.
It's a scientific method again. It's cosmopolitan. It respects human rights and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of congruence there. What it adds to the psycho-humanism, I think, is the practical part. It's the exercises. It's like, okay, fine, this is great in theory. Now what do I do in my life? Which is, to go back to the beginning of this story, is what I found, to my surprise, was missing when I started experiencing life crisis, was missing from my understanding of psycho-humanism. Like, okay, well, now what? Yeah, the principles I agree, but what am I supposed to do in practice?
I should be a nice person. Okay, that's a principle. How do
I
be
how
a nice
am I?
person?
Yeah, what does that mean in practice, right? So I think that that's one of the reasons I think that to go very well together. It's not the only possible choice. I can easily imagine a secular Buddhist, for instance, who also is a psycho-humanist. Because as it turns out, Buddhist ethics is very similar to Stoic ethics, even though the metaphysics are very different. But there's a number of secular Buddhists today who reject the ancient metaphysics.
And a lot of Confucianism is very aligned with that practical aspect of this is how you do things in your life to have a better life, to be better for other people.
So I would never argue that Stoicism is the way of sort of navigating your life, but it certainly is a good way of doing it. And it is one that goes well both with modern science and with a sort of a secular outlook on things.
Well, those are very exciting ways of being able to tell somebody who is secular humanist or an atheist or agnostic about it and saying, okay, there is something out there that's going to enrich my life, going to make it better. If you were going to say to somebody, let's say 100 years in the future and stuff, today we're trying to do this. This is what I see as the ethics and the path for the future. You would say it's Stoicism, right?
I would say Stoicism is definitely one path toward the future. Yeah.
And how do you feel like that would manifest itself in a greater context of civilization and stuff? How do you envision that? I mean, you obviously wrote a book to tell the world about it.
Right. So one of the things about Stoicism in particular, about sort of virtue ethics more in general, is that it's not a top-down approach to ethics. It's a kind of a bottom-up. In other words, you don't make the world better by imposing a particular view of the world, even a particular view of ethics, on other people. You make the better world one person at a time. Once the people get convinced of two fundamental things, A, that they should become better individuals, better people, and B, that certain things are up to them and other things are not up to them, then they start the process of working on things. And the notion is that, so Zeno of Citium, who was the founder of the Stoic school, actually, he lived near the end of the 4th century in BC in Athens. And he wrote a book called The Republic. We only have fragments, unfortunately, left of the book. But he described in this book what an ideal Stoic society would look like. And it's kind of interesting because, first of all, men and women commingle, and they all have the same roles, and they're interchangeable, and which, as I said, was surprising for the time. It's surprising even for today, and still a large number of people don't think that is actually a viable option. But more broadly, basically, what he's describing almost feels like a enlightened form of anarchism. The notion is that, if people start really working on themselves and using reason to improve society, well, then that's how the whole thing is going to work. Yeah, you need laws, for sure, because society is too large for just letting everybody do whatever the hell they want. But the notion is even the people who pass those laws, the people who propose those laws, are going to be people who are striving actively to become better individuals. Now imagine if today's politicians actually took seriously the notion that in order to be a good politician, you have to be a virtuous person. Yeah, exactly.
It's an oxymoron.
Exactly, right?
A good person and a politician. I don't
Right.
know. Doesn't
But
seem to
some
mix.
of those people actually are good people. They are well-intentioned. The problem is that we have a system that kind of almost selects those people out, right? That the only people, particularly in the United States, given how much money you need to actually even run for an election, let alone actually get elected.
Well, they look at it and say, is this really worth it for me?
Correct.
To go through all the hassle and the problems that you have to go through in terms of trying to represent other people.
So we have systemic problems. The Stoic answer, just like the Buddhist answer, is right. So the system isn't going to fix itself. You need people who are working on themselves, and then they want to work on fixing the system. It's not going to happen top down. It's going to happen bottom up. That's an interesting bet. I mean, whether they're right or not, it remains to be seen. But I'm
So you
comfortable
think
with that
in the
bet.
future it's going to just be people now and going forward improving themselves and,
Yes.
and paying attention to themselves? And do you think it's possible for each individual person to be able to do this of their own volition?
Well, the Stoics would say that yes, ultimately it should be possible, except for extreme cases, like for instance, if your brain is seriously damaged and you can't think straight, then fine.
Yeah.
Then you're literally sick and you need help. But if you're talking about a normal range of human behavior and human cognitive abilities, they think that it is possible. Now, they were not blind to the fact that people are hampered by all sorts of things. Their genetic lottery that may not turn out great. They're hampered by their early developmental environment. If your family is not particularly supportive or nurturing, if your society is not particularly nurturing or supportive, you do have problems. But ultimately, their notion was like, yes, this can all explain why you get there more slowly, why initially you might want to, you go into different paths that are not particularly conducive. But at some point, when they thought that literally what it means to be an adult, to become an adult, is to take charge of your own character, of your own reasons for doing things or not doing things. And so ultimately, that is one thing that is up to you. It doesn't matter where you started. At some point, if you're in your 20s, then 30s, then your 40s, and so on, you can't blame your parents for everything.
Well, it's almost like an objectivist point of view, that everybody's taking care of themselves, that they're ultimately responsible for themselves.
If by objectives you mean the Ayn Rand version of things, that's a whole different discussion. Interestingly, Ayn Rand was actually inspired by Aristotle.
Yeah.
Although one can argue that she kind of misunderstood Aristotle in important respects. But she did take that more, what I was referring to earlier as that more elitist take on things that Aristotle has. Remember, Aristotle tells you that if you don't have a good upbringing and a little bit of money and good looks and all that, you're just screwed and that's it. There's nothing you can do. The Stoics have a more ecumenical philosophy from that perspective. For the Stoic, so long as you want to improve, you can improve. That doesn't mean that everybody becomes, they often use...
Or whether it's easy.
Right, or whether it's easy. So they often use a lot of analogies and metaphors, and one of their recurrent analogies is with athletes, right? And so it's not like, they're not telling you that everybody can become an Olympic runner or a medalist or something like that. But what they're telling you is everybody can go to the gym and can get better, right? So... yeah, I can go to the gym. I'm never going to be, an Olympic anything.
Yeah.
But is my body going to improve if I actually, do the whole thing seriously and so on? Yes, of course it is. Right?
Eat better.
You eat better. You go to a gym regularly, etc. You become better. You get a better, better body and better, more health. The same exact thing as far as the Stoics are concerned goes for your character. If you work on it, it will get better. Will you become, a saint, or what is their word for a saint was a sage? No, very few people are sages, but it doesn't matter. You're still getting better.
So you see, as in the future, it's going to be vast majority of the people are going to be following this type of ethics that gets them to improve themselves, that focuses on themselves.
Yeah.
It's the actions that they can take that have an outcome versus the things that they can't really control. and do it, but it's vast majority, or if not everybody, would do it.
Yeah.
That would be the ideal for you.
That would be
right?
the ideal. Now, whether we get there or not, it's a question of, it's an empirical.
Some people think that in terms of society, you have people that have more of a stronger personality to do that, and other people are have a personality that's more submissive to being told what to do.
Right.
And they want somebody else to give them the answers, want them to tell them what to do and stuff. Right. That's just part of their personality, is how to do that. To ask somebody like that to say, okay, you need to focus on these things in order to improve your own life, I don't think it can happen with everybody.
Well, I mean, nothing happens with everybody necessarily. And that's why I said that there is no universal answer to these kind of questions. But is it going to be helpful to a lot of people? I think so.
We're talking about just helping generally a lot of people.
Right. I'm optimistic that a lot of people can be helped that way. One of the reasons why, as you correctly state, a lot of people don't go that way or think that their character is naturally not going that way, etc. So we don't really have in our society, we don't practice moral education. Yeah. I mean, when we think about education, we tend to think about books and stuff that is useful to get a job, which is fine. That you need that.
But the let's say American culture is that, well, that morality is up to each individual person. You're not going to tell somebody what that morality or that ethic is. That's up for them to decide.
And the Stoics would say that's a fatal mistake. There's more than one way to be moral, that's for sure. That there's more than one, correct path or good path to go through life from an ethical perspective. But no, this notion that everybody makes up his own, it's nonsense. I mean, that's essentially relativism. And it goes against human nature. I mean, one of the problem is, by nature, we tend to be social animals. So for instance, any kind of ethics that is antisocial, it's not good. It's not good for you, and it's not good for the rest of society.
So if somebody's looking at it and saying, okay, I want to improve and I want to get better and stuff, there is kind of a universal moral, ethical code, very basic, that can be taught, that can be shown as this is the better way of doing it.
There is at least some universal principles. So there is some research about this. Psychologists have done cross-cultural research on the concept of virtue, which we talked about earlier. And it turns out that every literate culture in the world has a concept of virtue. It also turns out that they pretty much all recognize the same subset of virtues. There is variation, of course, between cultures, as that is always the case in humanity, right? You pick something, there's going to be variation. But there is a core of about 6 attitudes or virtues that are pretty much present in every society. And these 6, interestingly, are the 4 Stoic ones, or variations thereabout. People use different terms, but those are the same 4 concepts. The Stoic, which I said also are the Christian ones. You find very similar virtues in Buddhism and so on and so forth. But those 4, plus these other two are often referred to as transcendence and humanity. Humanity is an attitude that reminds you that you are in fact a member of a larger sort of society, and that your thriving in life depends on the fact that you're interconnected with other people, and therefore.
So you wake up in the morning, you see the sunrise, you realize you're part of this greater world, you're somewhat insignificant, but then you turn around and you're facing everybody else and realizing, they're also part of this world too.
Correct. So the Stoics didn't call this a virtue, but as I said earlier, they did have a concept of cosmopolitanism, which turns out to be essentially doing the same, carrying the same function. The 6th one is referred to as transcendence. So transcendence is this notion that there is something in the world that's greater than yourself. Now, and that it's meaningful. Now, a lot of people cash that out as the notion of God, obviously, right? So lots of religions across the world, lots of people think that in terms of transcendence, what's transcendent is the existence of some kind of divinity. But that's not the only way to cash out transcendence, right? So, as I mentioned earlier, the Stoics were in awe of the laws of nature and how rational they are, and how perfectly they work, and how consistently they work. So they used that as transcendence. When Marcus Aurelius was looking at the sunrise, that was an exercise in transcendence. It was reminding himself that it was part of a sort of a broader whole. It doesn't have to be cashed down in terms of God. It often is, but it doesn't have to be. So those 6 seem to be pretty much universal. Now, why would they be universal? I think that's because they address something fundamental about human nature. In the human beings are essentially social. We're obviously pro-social animals. We don't do well in isolation. We thrive only in a social group. And we are capable of reason. That doesn't mean we're reasonable all the time or even most of the time, but we're capable of reason. We're actually reflecting on what we're doing and decided that we might want to do otherwise, right? For the Stoics and for a lot of other traditions, those 2 things are fundamental: reason and pro-sociality. And the Stoics actually turn it into a motto. The motto of their school is live according to nature. And live according to nature doesn't mean run naked into the woods and hug trees, although there's nothing wrong with that. It means use the 2 fundamental components of your human nature. Use your reason in order to improve society. That's what makes for a meaningful human life. If you use your ability to think through stuff, through problems, through issues, in order to improve everybody's life. The Stoics didn't make much of a distinction between your self interest and your societal interest. They thought that if you improve yourself, you're automatically improving society. And if you're working to make the world a better place, you're automatically making things better for you. So this sharp distinction that we tend to think about in terms of, well, there's me over here and then there is the rest of the world over there. The Stoics, just like the Buddhists, Buddhists think that the major problem in the world is suffering, the existence of suffering, and they think that the major cause of suffering is too much ego. Right? So the Buddhist notion of no self is often misunderstood as suggesting that they think that there is no self, that we don't exist as individuals. That's not true. The Buddhists are convinced that we exist as individuals. But we should try to be a little less self-important. We should try to be a little bit more chill about this ego, because it's the ego that wants stuff all the time, that wants things all the time, that wants control over all the time, and thereby causes suffering to both other people and
there's
ourselves.
probably evolutionary reasons why that can work for us, is that we kind of need people to survive, so we want to be part of you could call it a tribe, community, whatever. But though also we want to feel special within that community. We want to find something that's unique and valuable about us that other people might find as unique and valuable in us on there. But then we also have, in a political sense, we have conservatism saying that I am the master of my own world and I take care of things and it's about the person doing it. Right. And then you have the liberal side where they're saying, well, we're part of a community, we're part of a world. Right. And that we need to help improve the world, and there are certain things that we can do in terms of our actions that help improve that and stuff. So it seems like a really solid Stoic viewpoint is kind of like a medium of all that.
Correct. It's the notion that there is no contradiction in realizing, in accepting that we are members of a community and highly interdependent from that community, and yet we also are own individuals. We also make up our own decisions to act or not to act. After all, as I said, the dichotomy of control is about what is under your control as opposed to somebody else's control.
It's not all predetermined.
No. Well,
determinism.
Yeah, that's an interesting issue. I mean, the Stoic metaphysics, as I said, does recognize universal cause and effect. So technically, actually, they're determinists. In modern parlance, in terms of what we call free will, they didn't use that term. Yeah. But in terms of what we call free will, they're actually compatibilists. So they think that, which is actually happens to be also the majority position among modern philosophers. Compatibilism is this notion that, yep, we live in a deterministic universe. There's no way out of it. You're not an exception to the laws of nature. You're part of it. But at the same time, there is a meaningful sense in which your actions are yours. And that meaningful sense is this. Your actions are yours because you're not a puppet to whom things happen, that the rest of the world, you're not being thrown around by the rest of the world. You're part of the causal web of, the web of cause and effect of the world. So in other words, things happen also through you. You're actually part of this thing. Chrysippus, who was the third head of the Stoic school in Athens, came up with this interesting metaphor to explain the concept. He said, so imagine a cylinder, right? And if you put a cylinder on the floor and then you nudge it, you give it a little bit of a push, what's going to happen? Well, the cylinder is going to roll, right? Now, if I ask you, why is the cylinder rolling? The intuitive answer is, well, because I just pushed it, right? But that's not the whole answer. It's also in the nature of the cylinder to roll. If I push a cube, the cube isn't going to roll. If I push a cone, the cone isn't going to roll. It's going to do something else. If I push a sphere, right? So the rolling is a result of two sets of forces. Some are external, my pushing on the object, and some are actually internal, in the nature of the cylinder itself. So Chrysippus says the same thing goes for human beings. Sure, things happen to you, and events from the world at large will push you one way or the other. But the way you go, it's not just the result of external forces. You're not a puppet in the wind. You also have internal causality. I mean, this thing here, the human brain, is a generator of causal decision making. Right? Every time we make a decision.
I think I like to describe it as I like to have the illusion of my free will, even though I have my own personality. I'm going to do certain things, and my personality is going to go that way. But I like the idea that I have a free will to choose otherwise.
Right, but it depends on when we talk about free will, it depends on how people define freedom, right? Because if you mean freedom from the universal laws of cause and effect, no, we don't have that, quite obviously, because that would be literally a miracle, right? And so, no, you don't have that. There's no question about it. But if we're talking about freedom as in my own actions when I will them are impeded, then yes, we do have that kind of freedom, right? So when I explain this to my students, I ask somebody, I just raise my arm, I do like this, and then I ask one of my students to forcefully raise my arm. I say it's the same action, right? But in the first case, it's my free will that is doing the thing. It's my decision to act, and it's not impeded by anything. In the second case, it's somebody else. It's an external force, even against my own will. If you don't see the difference between those two, I can't help you. Those are really different phenomena. And if you're telling me, well, they're both just the result of deterministic forces, like, yeah, sure.
Yeah, but some people describe it as like, okay, if we look back at what happened yesterday, well, that's what happened yesterday, and it was bound to happen yesterday, and that was the course of what happened yesterday, so therefore you don't have any real free will over that and stuff. And
well, certainly not on what happened yesterday. That's for sure.
Well, I mean, it happened.
Yeah.
If I was describing my life, it's like, well, I did that yesterday, and so that's what happened. I have a hard time describing that as saying that that's a definition of not having free will, because it happened. It's the circumstances led up to that, and you're going to have circumstances going to lead up to what you do to what happens today, right. And you have very little or really no determination on it, and I don't think that that's correct. I think the way you were describing it with your arm and stuff, I think that's correct. I can lift this arm today and I can lift that one tomorrow. I can choose whatever I want to. Someday somebody's going to lift both of my arms.
Yeah, that's right.
Or they're going to hold them down.
Or they're going to hold them down. Yeah, that's right. Now, there's another thing that I forgot to address earlier, because you asked me this question, and it should be part of this discussion. You're correct near the beginning of this discussion when you said that the stereotype is the Stoics are people who go around life with a stiff upper lip and suppressing emotion, like as Mr. Spock from Star Trek. Although even Spock, as it turns out, is more complicated than that. So, like many stereotypes, there is a grain of truth there, right? Yeah. But it's only a grain, and it's important to understand what's happening there. So, the stiff upper lip part comes out of the fact that Stoics do think that endurance is a value. It's something that is useful, right? So when there are things that you cannot do anything about, that you cannot do otherwise, then the only option is to either endure them or to just start screaming and complaining and invoking bloody hell.
Well, sometimes that's very satisfying.
It may be satisfying, but it's often not very useful.
Yeah.
Because what happens is you're already making a situation that is bad for you miserable by convincing yourself that it's actually miserable by starting screaming about it for the hell of it.
But it can be cathartic sometimes to just yell and scream and just let your emotions out for, I'm mad for 2 seconds, but I'm mad.
Sure,
you know?
But if you get into the notion of I need to complain, I need to get mad, and so on and so forth, even about things that you can't do anything about, there is a danger that you're going to just dwell on the complaining and not actually address the situation.
For it to continue, obviously, would be a problem.
Right. So endurance to some extent is in fact a Stoic value. It's like, okay, well, if you can't do anything about it, fine. Move on. Do something else.
Move on.
Right. The emotional stuff is interesting. Stoics definitely do not try to suppress emotions. What they do try to do, however, is the following. So they think of emotions as in part cognitively constructed. In other words, your emotions are not just a feeling that you cannot control. They are a combination of raw feelings and your own thinking about certain situations. So if you're afraid of somebody, for instance, or something, or a situation, it's not just because you heard a loud noise and you jump. Yes, that happens, and that's definitely not under your control. But if you start thinking, oh my gosh, there's a loud noise, so that's clearly a terrorist attack. I need to be afraid of terrorists. And by the way, they come all from certain countries. Now you're actually adding a bunch of thinking on that stuff. There's a lot of cognition. And your emotion becomes a result, it becomes disruptive to your life. It's what the Stoics call a negative emotion.
Well, for me, I have a Myers-Briggs personality inventory, and the last thing is about whether you're a judger or not. Where you make strong, instantaneous judgments about people, about things, about circumstances. And I did recognize that when I was younger, and I was like, that's not probably the best way to react to the world.
Correct. So the Stoics say, slow down. Hold on. Before you start going all this in this direction about making up stories about what's going on, let's slow down, take time to actually analyze the situation and see what happens. They also definitely cultivate what they call positive emotions. So negative emotions are things like fear, anger, hatred, things like that. Those are defined by the Stoic as the kind of emotions that get in your way of thinking straight.
They're not helpful, they're a waste of time.
But then there's positive emotions. Joy about what you're doing and why you're doing it. Love for other people, for humanity at large. A sense of justice. All of those are actually, they think of that as positive emotions, and they say that part of the point of Stoic training is to move away from the negative emotions and to actually positively cultivate the constructive emotions, the positive emotions.
And doing forgiveness and thanksgiving and to be appreciative. I think those are all basic human emotions that are on the right side of things than they are on the not productive, not helpful. I think since we're an ethical culture, I feel like Adler talked a lot as like your interaction with somebody else, you want them to treat you like you want to be treated, but he said it more, and it was like, I'm going to treat you as to elicit the best out of you to respond to me. Yeah. And I think it goes hand in hand with you talking about Stoicism, is like, you're going to want to deal with other people, so you're going to get the best response out of them. You don't have these negative problems and negative emotions and stuff. And sometimes that's better than we want to, or we perceive that we want to treat ourselves. Yeah. And it's always trying to go to a higher ground, I guess, is the best way to try to describe that.
Yes, exactly.
On doing that stuff. So I think those are all positive things that we can all share in terms of being part of this human nature or this human existence that we have. Make the most out of it while we're here.
Exactly.
And stuff. So you've been very enlightening. So enlightened, secular humanist, Stoic, all those things. It's all very good stuff. So
I think it is.
Thank you very much for your time.
It was a pleasure.
Appreciate it. Bye.